Hello again, Dan Alasso here with another chapter of U.S. History 1. And this chapter is about war and industry. And so, to begin about where we left off with the Napoleonic Wars, if you recall, they lasted from about 1803 to about 1815, with a break briefly when Napoleon was defeated in Russia in 1812 and then deposed and banished to Elba. Both France and Britain had been attacking American ships, which they seized regularly. England was the major offender, with the Royal Navy implementing a practice of impressing American sailors into its service, based on the claim that they were really British sailors who had deserted from the Royal Navy. The issue came to a head in 1807 when the British warship, the HMS Leopard, opened fire on a U.S. naval ship off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. The British boarded the ship and they took 4 sailors. Now, President Jefferson lacked the power to force Britain to stop. So instead, he responded with a ban on trade that he hoped would resemble the boycotts of the pre-revolutionary era. The Embargo Act of 1807 prohibited American ships from leaving their ports until Britain and France stopped seizing them on the high seas. In early January, the act was amended to include fishing boats and coastal traders and even whalers. American commerce came to nearly a dead stop. Americans hoped that cutting off all of this trade once again would damage the British and the French economies severely enough that the seizures would end. However, while the embargo did have an economic impact on Britain, American commercial interests suffered even more. The embargo hurt American farmers in addition to merchants, and seaport cities saw increased unemployment and a rise in bankruptcies. American business activity actually dropped by 75%, or 3/4, from 1808 to 1809. Enforcing the embargo was really difficult, especially in states that bordered British Canada. Smuggler's Notch in Vermont, for example, earned its name from the illegal trade northward. President Jefferson attributed the problems with the embargo to lax enforcement. But the British merchants still weren't that bothered. They shifted their purchasing of raw materials and their sales of manufactured goods to South America. And many were actually happy to have less competition from American merchants. Jefferson's critics complained that this president, who was supposed to be the champion of small government and a federal government that stayed out of the states and the people's affairs, had all of a sudden assumed extraordinary coercive powers to enforce this embargo. At the very end of his second term, Jefferson gave in a bit to the pressure and signed the Non-Intercourse Act of 1808. And this lifted the embargoes except those specifically with Britain and France. In the election of 1808, American voters elected another Virginian Democratic Republican, James Madison. The Federalists once again had nominated South Carolinian Charles C. Pinckney, whom Jefferson had already beaten decisively in 1804. And although Pinckney once again did poorly in the South against the Virginian Madison, he did a little better in the Federalist-leaning New England states than he previously had, which suggests something about the level of their dissatisfaction with the Democratic Republicans and their policies. President Madison inherited Jefferson's foreign policy problems with Britain and France, and for most people in the United States, especially for those in the West, Great Britain was beginning to be seen as the major problem. The issue that most concerned Americans on the western border was British support for native resistance. Under President Jefferson, the U.S. had practiced really 2 main policies towards the natives: forcing Indians to adopt American ways of agricultural life, and driving Indians into debt in order to get them to sell their lands. In 1809, Tecumseh, a war chief of the Shawnee, built a new Western Confederacy of tribes. His brother, Tenskwatawa, was a spiritual leader and a prophet who preached a revival of native ways and a rejection of Anglo-American culture, including alcohol. And Tecumseh's specific problem was he objected to a treaty that had been signed by some, but not all of the tribes in the region, which sold 3 million acres of land to the United States. William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, argued that the treaty that he had negotiated was valid and that the Indians who had signed it had been authorized to act for all of their people. While Tecumseh was away trying to rally support for his cause, William Henry Harrison attempted to eliminate these objections to his land acquisition by attacking Prophetstown, which was the settlement named in honor of Tenskwatawa. In the ensuing Battle of Tippecanoe, U.S. forces destroyed the settlement and also confiscated 5,000 bushels of corn and beans that the Indians had saved for the winter. And they also claimed that they had found evidence that the British had been supplying the Western Confederacy with weapons, despite the stipulations of earlier treaties. The seizure of American ships, the impressment of sailors, and British support for this Indian resistance led to calls for war against Great Britain from people who became known as war hawks, who were led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And they both spoke angrily in Congress of the British insults to American honor. Opposition to the war came from Federalists from the Northeast, who knew that this type of war was going to disrupt fishing and maritime trade, on which their region's economy depended. A potential silver lining was a proposed invasion of Canada, which was a perennial interest of many Americans, especially in the Northeast. So in a narrow vote, Congress decided and authorized President Madison to declare war against Great Britain in June 1812. The war went very badly for the United States. In August 1812, the U.S. lost Detroit to the British and their Indian allies, including a force of over 1,000 men led by Tecumseh. By the end of the year, the British controlled half of the Northwest Territory. The following year, however, U.S. forces did manage to score a few victories. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry defeated British naval forces on Lake Erie. And at the Battle of the Thames in Ontario, the U.S. defeated the British and their native allies. And in this battle, Tecumseh was killed, which meant that the Indian resistance lost its most important leader of that time. And that helped to open the Indiana and the Michigan territories for white settlement after the war ended. In April 1813, American troops led by General Zebulon Pike captured and burned York, Ontario, now known as Toronto. These victories didn't turn the tide of the war, however. Britain had gained an upper hand in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and Napoleon had been deposed in 1812, and this allowed battle-hardened British combat troops to be diverted to fight in the U.S. In July 1814, 4,500 British soldiers sailed up Chesapeake Bay and burned Washington, D.C. to the ground in retaliation for York. That summer, the British shelled Baltimore, but failed to dislodge American defenders at Fort McHenry, whose survival of the bombardment inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. With the end of fighting in Europe, Britain was eager to end the conflict in the Americas as well. In 1814, British and U.S. diplomats began meeting in Flanders, in northern Belgium, to negotiate the Treaty of Ghent, which was signed in December. The boundaries between the U.S. and British Canada remained as they had been before the war, which was very lucky for the U.S., considering how badly we had done, although it was a disappointment to some Americans who had hoped to gain territory to the north and to liberate the Canadians from the tyranny of British rule. Due to slow communication, however, the last battle of the War of 1812 actually happened after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed. Andrew Jackson had distinguished himself during the war by attacking the Creek Indians in March 1814 before invading Florida in May. After taking Pensacola, Jackson moved his force of Tennessee fighters to New Orleans to defend the port against British attack. In January 1815, British veterans of the Napoleonic Wars tried to take the port. Jackson's forces repelled the British, killing over 2,000. Although the war was over and the battle's outcome didn't change the terms of the treaty, the Battle of New Orleans did catapult Andrew Jackson to national prominence as a war hero. And in the 1820s, he would emerge as the head of a new Democratic Party. The war was very unpopular in New England because it damaged the economy of the region so badly. And this unpopularity strengthened the Federalist Party in New England one final time. Many Federalists also deeply resented the power of this Virginian dynasty of Jefferson and Madison, who appeared indifferent to their region. The extent of the Federalist discontent became clear in December 1814 at the Hartford Convention, which was a meeting of 26 Federalists in Connecticut, where some of the attendees actually suggested that New England should secede from the United States. These arguments for disunion, combined with the convention's condemnation of the federal government during wartime, fatally discredited the Federalist Party and accelerated its downfall. After the 1816 election, in which the Democratic Republican James Monroe, also a Virginian, easily defeated his Federalist rival Rufus King, the Federalist Party never again ran a presidential candidate. During the War of 1812, the Bank of the United States had suspended payments in specie, or hard money, gold and silver coins. When the war ended, the bank continued to issue only paper banknotes to redeem notes issued by state banks. And newly chartered banks adopted this practice, issuing more banknotes than the amount of specie, or actual cash, in their vaults. Printing more notes than a bank could back up with hard cash worked as long as people were content to conduct their business in paper money and didn't demand that the banks redeem the notes in gold and silver that was supposed to back them. In most cases, though, people were happy to use paper money because gold and silver were bulky and inconvenient, and because the notes often came with interest attached. A lot of the paper circulating as currency at this time was actually promissory notes, or agreements to pay a certain sum at a future date, say, for example, $100 in 60 days, including interest. The problem was that if large numbers of people or banks that had loaned money to other banks began to demand specie payments, the banking system could collapse because there really wasn't enough actual money, actual specie, to support the amount of paper that the banks had all put into circulation. Bankers were so afraid of runs, in which customers would demand gold and silver, that in one case, an irate bank employee in Ohio stabbed a customer who had insisted on specie in exchange for the banknotes he was holding. The debts of the war and an economic bubble inflated by land fever burst in 1819, causing a depression known as the Panic of 1819. It was the first prolonged economic depression in American history, and people panicked as they saw prices of especially agricultural products fall and businesses fail. Prices had already begun falling in 1815 at the ultimate end of the Napoleonic Wars after Waterloo, when European demand for American crops began to wane and when Britain began to dump surplus manufactured goods into international markets. In 1818, crop prices fell by up to 75%, leaving farmers completely unable to pay their debts. As the farmers defaulted on their loans, the banks seized their property. But because this drastic fall in farm prices had deflated the value of land as well, the banks were left holding farms that they couldn't sell. And land speculators also lost their investments. As the countryside suffered, hard-hit farmers stopped buying manufactured goods. And this meant that the factories had to respond by cutting wages and firing employees. Also in 1818, the Second Bank of the United States, which had replaced the Bank of the United States in 1816 when its charter ran out, needed to pay specie, gold and silver, to foreign investors who had loaned money to the United States so that we could buy the Louisiana Territory in 1803. The bank began to call in loans, and it required the state banks to pay those loans off to the national bank in gold and silver. And of course, the consequences were severe. State banks closed their doors, more businesses failed. 3/4 of the workforce in Philadelphia was unemployed. Unemployment was 75%. And charities were swamped by thousands of people needing assistance. In states that still had imprisonment for debt, or debtors' prisons, the prison population also exploded. So as a result, many states began drafting laws to provide relief for debtors, or even bankruptcy laws. And even people at the top of the social ladder were affected by the Panic of 1819. Thomas Jefferson, who had co-signed a loan for a friend, nearly lost Monticello when his friend defaulted and left Jefferson responsible for the debt. To stimulate the economy, Congress passed the Land Law of 1820, allowing smaller parcels down to 80 acres of land to be sold. And then the Relief Act of 1821 allowed people in Ohio to return land to the government if they couldn't afford to keep it or keep up with the payments. And it extended the credit period to 8 years. States passed laws to prevent mortgage foreclosures so that buyers could keep their homes and farms. After 4 years, the Depression began to abate and the American economy began to grow again. Before the 1820s, the idea of social deference had been kind of a central feature of the Republic. Deference meant showing respect for people who had distinguished themselves through military accomplishments or education or business success or even family pedigree. As an antidote to mob rule, deference to what many Americans in the early Republic agreed was a natural aristocracy supported republicanism and its emphasis on virtue, the ideal of placing the common good above narrow self-interest. Republican statesmen of the 1780s and 1790s had expected and had received deferential treatment from other people. And ordinary Americans deferred to their social betters as a matter of course. Federalists believed that American deference was somehow less aristocratically based than it was in Britain. Their political opponents disagreed. For the generation who had lived through the American Revolution, of course, George Washington epitomized Republican virtue, and his judgment and decisions were considered to be beyond reproach. An Anglican minister named Mason Locke Weems contributed to the legend of Washington's unimpeachable virtue in his 1800 book, The Life of Washington. Generations of American children read Weems's fictional stories, such as the tale of the youthful Washington chopping down one of his father's cherry trees, and then, when confronted by his father, confessing, "Sir, I cannot tell a lie." Stories like those were told by Weems to emphasize Washington's nobility, and they also downplayed the fact that he was the wealthiest president in U.S. history, and that he had been an aristocrat long before he had become a revolutionary. The presidents who followed Washington shared the first president's pedigree to some extent. With the exception of John Adams, who was from Massachusetts, all the early presidents, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, were members of Virginia's aristocracy. And even Adams, although not nearly as wealthy as the Virginians, was also a member of New England's elite. The extensive educations that children of the upper classes got helped to prepare these men for their roles as leaders of a new society. One of the disadvantages faced by critics of the New Order was that they were often unable to articulate their concerns in the same tone and language that was used by the elite leaders. Of course, this doesn't mean that their concerns were not valid. In the early 1820s, deference began to wane. Although social mobility was certainly not universally available, enough men of modest ancestry were becoming successful in trades and businesses that the old elites had to make room for new money. Established families retained their privileges, of course, For example, the Society of the Cincinnati to this day is made up of the descendants of Revolutionary officers, not of soldiers. But new voices did demand to be heard, and a new type of deference began to take hold as well, reflecting not so much hereditary ruling class status, but the will of the majority. This is a phrase that we begin to hear now. And the spirit of democratic reform was shown in a widespread and growing belief that all white men, regardless of whether or not they owned property, had the right to participate in politics, or at least in elections. Before the 1820s, many state constitutions had imposed property qualifications for voting to reduce democratic tendencies that the Federalists considered mob rule. However, as federalism fell out of favor, ordinary men from the middle and sometimes even lower classes increasingly began to question the idea that property ownership was the only indication of Republican virtue. They argued for universal manhood suffrage, or voting rights for all white male adults. So it wasn't really that universal. Some of these men had strong beliefs about issues that affected them, but many, or most, did not have the time or the energy or the education to debate political philosophy as the elite members of the founding generation had done. And so, political leaders began to focus on crafting platforms and messages that would attract this new electorate. New states adopted constitutions without property qualifications for voting, often as a way to stimulate migration across their borders. Vermont and Kentucky, admitted to the Union in 1791 and 1792, granted voting rights to all white men, regardless of whether they owned property or paid taxes. Ohio's state constitution put a minor tax-paying requirement on voters. Indiana in 1816, Illinois in 1818, Alabama 1819 also extended the right to vote to white men regardless of property. Even old states reacted to these changing times. In Connecticut, federalism collapsed after that Hartford Convention, and then even more so in 1818 when the state held a new constitutional convention. The new constitution granted voting rights to all white men who paid taxes or who had served in the militia. Similarly, New York amended its constitution in 1821 and also removed property qualifications for voting. However, race and gender typically replaced property qualifications for voting rights. New Jersey changed its laws to explicitly restrict the vote to white men only. Connecticut passed a law in 1814, taking the right to vote away from free black men. By the 1820s, 80% of the white male population could vote in New York state elections. But at the same time, New York disenfranchised free black men in 1822 by requiring that men of color, as they called them, must own property worth at least $250. Free black men had had the right to vote under New York's Constitution since 1777. The new property qualification put voting out of their reach. In addition to expanding white men's rights to vote, these new democratic ideals led to a new style of political organization, which was most evident in New York State in the years after the War of 1812. Under the leadership of Martin Van Buren, New York's Bucktail Democratic-Republican faction gained political power by cultivating loyalty to what they called the will of the majority, rather than to an elite family or to a famous figure. The Bucktails, who were named for the deer tails that members wore in their hats to identify their membership in the Tammany Society, they were more focused on winning than on ideology. For example, at first, the Bucktails opposed the Erie Canal project that had been advocated by fellow Democratic Republican DeWitt Clinton. But when the popularity and the financial success of the canal became evident, they supported it. DeWitt Clinton, the nephew of the New York governor and Jefferson's vice president, George Clinton, was a three-term mayor of New York City and then a senator before he became governor of the state. Bucktail leader Martin Van Buren was from an old Dutch family, but his father had been a tavern owner rather than a major general in the Continental Army like George Clinton. And Van Buren would go on to be the only U.S. president for whom English was a second language. One of the Bucktail's biggest achievements in New York was revising the state constitution in 1821 and 1822. Under the original Constitution, a council of appointments had selected local officials, such as sheriffs and town clerks and justice of the peace. The Bucktails replaced this process with a system of direct elections, which meant that thousands of jobs immediately became available to candidates who had the support of the majority. In practice, this meant that Van Buren's party could nominate and support their own candidates based on loyalty to the party. Van Buren created a political machine of disciplined party members who valued loyalty more than anything else. And that led to a future of patronage politics in the U.S. This technique of rewarding party loyalists is called the spoils system, from the expression "to the victor go the spoils." Van Buren's political machine radically transformed New York politics. The 1824 presidential election included tens of thousands of these new voters, and it broke the older system of having congressional caucuses determine who would run. The new voters had regional interests, and they voted them. For the first time, also, the popular vote mattered in the presidential election. Members of the Electoral College were chosen by popular vote in 18 states, with only 6 states using the older system in which state legislatures chose the electors. And with no caucus system, the presidential election in 1824 had 5 candidates, all running as Democratic Republicans. This crowded field included John Quincy Adams, the son of the second president, who had broken away from the Federalists in the early 1800s and then had served in a number of important diplomatic positions, including negotiating the peace treaty with Great Britain at Ghent in 1814. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina had served as Secretary of War and represented the slaveholding South. He actually dropped out of the presidential race and ran specifically for vice president. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, represented Kentucky and the western states. William H. Crawford, a plantation owner from Georgia, suffered a stroke in 1823 that left him largely incapacitated. But he stayed in the race because he had the backing of the New York machine headed by Martin Van Buren. And then finally, Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, rounded out the field. Jackson had very little formal education, but he was extremely popular for his military victories in the War of 1812 and in the wars against the Creek and Seminole nations. Jackson had been elected to the Senate in 1823, and the newspapers kept stories about his courage and his daring constantly in front of voters. Results from the 18 states where the popular vote determined the electoral vote gave Jackson a very clear victory, with nearly 153,000 votes to Adams's 114,000. Clay got 47,000 and Crawford got nearly 47,000 as well. But the Electoral College, however, was another matter. Of the 261 electoral votes available, Jackson needed 131 or better to win, but he got only 99. Adams got 84, Crawford got 41, and Clay got 37. Because Jackson didn't receive a majority in the Electoral College, the election was kicked over to the House of Representatives under the terms of the 12th Amendment. The House Speaker, Henry Clay, really didn't want to see Jackson become president, and so he swung the vote to Adams. And once in office, Adams immediately appointed Henry Clay his Secretary of State. To Jackson and his supporters, of course, the certification of Adams and then his immediate appointment of Clay reeked of anti-democratic corruption. And even John C. Calhoun, who did become John Quincy Adams' vice president, labeled the whole affair a corrupt bargain. And Jackson supporters vowed revenge against this anti-majoritarian theft of the election in 1824. Secretary of State Henry Clay championed what became known as the American system, which included a national bank, high tariffs, and federally sponsored internal improvements. President Adams proposed a national university and a naval academy to train future leaders of the Republic. The president's opponents criticized what they saw as the administration's catering to a small, privileged elite class at the expense of ordinary citizens. And using the proceeds of land sales in the West, Adams endorsed the creation of roads and canals to facilitate commerce and to advance settlement in the West. Despite the successful opening of the very profitable Erie Canal in 1825, which New York had financed on its own when it couldn't get federal money, many people in Congress still opposed federal spending on internal improvements, arguing that the Constitution did not give the federal government the power to fund these projects. In the end, Adams did succeed in extending the Cumberland Road into Ohio, and he broke ground on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal on July 4th, 1828. Tariffs, which both Clay and Adams promoted, had been used since 1789 to raise money to operate the government, and since 1790 to support domestic manufacturing by making imports more expensive. Congress had also passed tariff acts in 1816 and 1824. And Clay pushed for even higher tariffs, and in 1828, President Adams proposed a 50% tariff on imported goods. Opponents denounced the 1828 bill as the Tariff of Abominations, saying that it was clear evidence that the federal government was preferring and favoring northern manufacturing over southern agriculture. Since the South imported far more manufactured goods than the North, the tariff would fall most heavily on southern consumers, they argued. The 1828 tariff also suggested that the federal government could take these types of arbitrary unilateral steps that hurt the South. And this led some Southerners to begin to fear that the foundation of the Southern social and economic lifestyle, slavery, might one day come under attack from a hostile Northern majority. The spokesman for this Southern view was, of all people, President Adams' Vice President, John C. Calhoun. Just as the French Revolution had triggered the Haitian, the Napoleonic Wars ignited wars for independence in Spanish America, when King Ferdinand VII of Spain was replaced by Napoleon with Joseph Bonaparte, his brother. In 1811, Venezuela and Paraguay both declared their independence, with Argentina and Chile following in 1816 and 1818. In 1824, the Venezuelan Simón Bolívar, who had led the liberation of Gran Colombia, conclusively defeated the Spanish armies at Junín and Sucre, and Peru also gained its independence. A year later, the eastern part of the old Viceroyalty of Peru became a separate country named after the liberator, Bolivia. Gran Colombia was a republic that included territory that's now in Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Panama, northern Peru, western Guyana, and northwest Brazil. Bolívar was elected president from 1819 to 1830, and he hoped that Latin America would follow the example of the United States and create a federal union of all of these newly independent little nations, or at least a common economic market. He convened a Congress of the Americas in Panama in the summer of 1826, and he invited all the nations of Latin America and also the United States. President Adams didn't have a super high opinion of Latin Americans, but he was an opponent of slavery, and all of the new Spanish American republics had immediately outlawed the slave trade and had either abolished slavery outright or had initiated its gradual disappearance. Unfortunately, the southern states were less enthusiastic about closely aligning with anti-slavery nations, and they prevented the U.S. from sending a delegation in time to attend the conference. When Mexico also began its War of Independence in the 1810s, the Spanish government sent a general named Agustín de Iturbide against the rebels, but Vicente Guerrero's army beat Iturbide on the battlefield, and then Guerrero convinced him to join the revolution. In 1821, the two allied under what was called the Plan de Iguala, or the Plan of the Three Guarantees, which proclaimed Mexico's independence and declared that, quote, all inhabitants, without distinction of their European, African, or Indian origins, are citizens, with full freedom to pursue their livelihoods according to their merits and virtues. The 1828 American presidential campaign highlighted the difference between the newly expanded electorate and the older, more exclusive Adams style of government. The slogan, Adams who can write, Jackson who can fight, captured the contrast between the highly educated but aristocratic Adams and Jackson, who was portrayed as a frontiersman and a war hero with little formal education but great real-world experience. And, of course, the party organization that promoted Andrew Jackson reminded voters constantly of the corrupt bargain of 1824. Jackson's campaign framed his previous loss as a stolen election by a small group of political elites deciding who would lead the nation in a self-serving manner and for their own benefit, ignoring the all-important will of the majority. Though he didn't make a lot of public appearances, Jackson did make a campaign speech in New Orleans on January 8th, the anniversary of his defeat of the British in 1815. And he also engaged in long discussions with politicians who came to his home, the Hermitage in Nashville. Jackson supporters worked to bring as many new voters as possible into this election. Local rallies and parades sent the message that Jackson stood for the common man against the corrupt elite that was backing Adams and Clay. Jackson's supporters called themselves the Democracy, and we remember them as Democrats, to distinguish themselves from their Democratic Republican opponents. In November 1828, Jackson won an overwhelming victory over Adams, capturing 56% of the popular vote and 68% of the electoral vote. As in 1800, when Jefferson had won over the Federalist incumbent John Adams, the presidency passed peacefully to a new political party, the Democrats. The 1828 election was also the end of the older politics of deference. When he became president, amid accusations of widespread fraud, including the charge that $300,000 had gone missing from the Treasury Department, Jackson removed almost half of all of the appointed federal government officers. Lucrative posts, such as postmaster and deputy postmaster, went to party loyalists, especially in places where Jackson's support had been the weakest, such as New England. Some Democratic newspaper editors who had supported Jackson during the campaign also gained public jobs. Jackson's opponents complained that this was a spoils system, like that of Van Buren's New York Bucktail Party. Rewarding party loyalists with government jobs resulted in spectacular instances of corruption. And the most notorious of those happened in New York City, where a Jackson appointee apparently made off with over $1 million. Critics said that the Democrats were disregarding merit and education and respectability and decorum, not to respect the will of the majority, but to line their own pockets. In addition to war and politics, of course, the first quarter of the 19th century saw the beginning of industrial capitalism in America. In the late 1790s and the early 1800s, Great Britain had had the most advanced textile mills and machines in the world, and the United States had continued to rely on Great Britain for finished goods. To maintain its economic advantage and to prevent knowledge from leaving the empire, the British had banned the emigration of mechanics and skilled workers who knew how to build and repair the latest textile machines. Some British mechanics, including Samuel Slater, had managed to travel to the US with information on the workings of the textile mills that British industrialist Richard Arkwright had invented and pioneered. In the 1790s in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, as I've already mentioned, Slater convinced several American merchants, including the wealthy Providence merchant Moses Brown, to finance a water-powered cotton mill based on the British models. The success of Slater and his partners inspired others to start building additional mills in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. By 1807, 13 more mills had been established. President Jefferson's embargo on British manufactured goods spurred even more New England merchants to invest. And by 1812, 78 new textile mills had been built in rural New England towns. Most initially turned out woolen goods, while the rest began producing cotton cloth. Slater's mills and those built in imitation of his were fairly small, employing only 60 or 70 people on the average. Under what was called the Rhode Island system, families were hired, and instead of being paid in cash, the father was given credit equal to the wages on his family's labor that could then be redeemed in the form of rent in company-owned housing or goods from the company store. The embargo of 1807 and then the War of 1812, as I said, spurred industrial development in the U.S. But even before the war, New England merchants, Nathan Appleton and Francis Cabot Lowell, had toured Britain's largest water-powered textile factory during a stay in Great Britain in 1810 and 1811. They memorized the designs of the machines that they saw at New Lanark in Scotland, especially the power loom, which had replaced individual hand weavers. In 1813, Appleton and Lowell formed the Boston Manufacturing Company and raised $400,000, and in 1814 established a textile mill in Waltham on the banks of the Charles River. At Waltham, cotton was carded and drawn into coarse strands of fibers called rovings, and then spun into yarn, and then the yarn was woven into cotton cloth. Yarn no longer had to be put out to farm families for further processing. All the work was now performed under one roof at a central location, the factory. Working in Lowell's mills was both mechanized and specialized. The putting out system had begun the process of separating skilled craft work into repetitive tasks. The factory expanded on this division of labor, and as the machines took over labor from humans, and people increasingly found themselves confined to the same repetitive step over and over and over again in a larger process, this was the beginning of de-skilling. The BMC opened additional textile mills on the Merrimack River, each employing hundreds of workers who lived in company towns, where the factories and the worker housing were owned by the company. The most famous of these company towns was Lowell, Massachusetts, which was built from the ground up on land that the Boston Manufacturing Company purchased in 1821 from the farm village of East Chelmsford, north of Boston. The BMC avoided the Rhode Island system, preferring individual workers to families. And these employees weren't difficult to find in New England. While young men could find work in a variety of occupations, young women had more limited options. So the textile mills provided ready employment for the daughters of Yankee farm families. To reassure anxious parents that their daughter's virtue would be protected and to maintain discipline, the BMC established strict rules governing the lives of these young mill girls. The women lived in company-owned boarding houses that they paid for out of their wages. They woke early to the sound of the bell, and they worked a 12-hour day, during which talking was forbidden. They could not swear or drink alcohol, and they had to attend church on Sundays. Overseers at the mills and boarding house keepers kept a close eye on the young women's behavior, and workers who misbehaved lost their jobs and were evicted. Mechanizing the production of formerly handicraft products and moving production from homes into factories dramatically increased the output of goods. For example, in a 1-month period, Rhode Island women who had spun yarn into cloth on hand looms in their homes had produced a total of 34,000 yards of fabrics of different types. By 1855, the women working in just one of Lowell's mechanized mills produced more than 43,000 yards. The BMC's cotton mills quickly gained a competitive edge over the smaller mills established by people like Samuel Slater and those who had followed him. In Massachusetts, the BMC built new mill towns in Chicopee and Lawrence and Holyoke. And in New Hampshire, they built Manchester and Dover and Nashua. And in Maine, they built a large mill on the Saco River. Other entrepreneurs copied them. By the beginning of the Civil War, 878 textile factories operated in New England. Altogether, these factories employed more than 100,000 people and produced more than 940 million yards of cloth a year. In addition to textiles, which formed the backbone of the early industrial revolution in the US, as it had in Britain, other crafts increasingly became more mechanized and centralized into factories in the first half of the 19th century. Products like shoes and leather and paper and hats and clocks and guns that had been produced by craftsmen or by putting out were all now produced in mechanized factories by the time of the Civil War. Flour milling became almost completely automated and centralized by the early decades of the 19th century, using technology developed by Oliver Evans. Evans's mills were so efficient that 2 employees could do the work that had required 5 or more, and mills using Evans's system spread throughout the mid-Atlantic states. At the end of the 18th century, most American families had lived in candlelit homes with bare floors and bare walls. They had cooked and warmed themselves over fireplaces, and they owned only a couple of changes of clothing. And most of them were farmers who produced nearly all the needs of their home. They occasionally would buy manufactured goods made by hand that were usually scarce and fairly expensive. Automated manufacturing changed that, making consumer goods that had once been thought of as luxuries widely available for the first time. Now, all but the very poor could afford the necessities, and some people could afford some of the luxuries of life. When women could buy New England textiles, they no longer had to spend their time spinning and weaving. Rooms would now be lit by oil lamps, which gave brighter light than candles. Homes would be heated by parlor stoves, which allowed for more privacy. People no longer all needed to huddle together around the hearth. Iron cook stoves with multiple burners made it possible for housewives to prepare more elaborate meals. And many people could afford carpets and upholstered furniture. And even farmers could decorate their homes with curtains and wallpaper. Clocks, which had once been quite expensive, were now within the reach of most ordinary people. And as more people worked in factories and lived in cities, they no longer grew their own food or made most of the things that they consumed. A new population of consumers grew right along with the new products available for them to consume. And as production became more mechanized and relocated into factories, life changed for the workers. Farmers and artisans had controlled the pace and the timing and the order of their labor. If an artisan wanted to take the afternoon off, he could. If a farmer decided to rebuild his fence on Thursday rather than on Wednesday, he could. People talked with each other and often drank during the workday. Journeymen were often actually paid in alcohol as part of their wages. In factories, there was discipline. Workers were expected to report early in the morning and to work all day. Employees couldn't leave when they were tired. They couldn't take breaks. Those who arrived late found their pay docked, and repeated tardiness would lead to firing. The monotony of the repetitive tasks made the days particularly long, and most factories worked people from 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. In the winter, when the sun set early, oil lamps were used to light the factory floor, and employees strained to see their work and coughed as the rooms filled up with smoke from the lamps. Not only had the people become dependent as employees in the way that Jefferson had feared, but basic freedoms were becoming limited. Drinking was prohibited. Some factories didn't allow their employees to sit down. Mills were often unbearably hot and humid in the summer and cold in the winter, which led to health problems. And the mills were often dangerous. Workplace injuries were common. Workers' hands and fingers could be maimed or even cut off when they were caught in machines. In some cases, entire limbs or bodies were crushed. Workers who didn't die from these types of injuries but could no longer work would lose their jobs. Corporal punishment of both children and adults was also common in factories. And where abuse was most extreme, children sometimes died as a result of the injuries that they suffered at the hands of overseers. And as the decades passed, working conditions deteriorated in many mills. Workers were assigned more and more machines to tend, and the owners continually increased the speed at which the machines operated. Wages were cut in many factories, and employees who had once worked for an hourly wage oftentimes were reduced to piecework, paid for the amount that they produced and not for the hours that they worked. Low wages, combined with regular periods of unemployment, made the lives of workers difficult, especially for people with families to support. In New York City in 1850, for example, the average male wage worker earned $300 a year, but it cost $600 a year to support a family of 5. Women earned even less, even when they did the same jobs as men. In spite of all these difficulties, some workers did benefit from the new wage opportunities that factory work presented. For many of those young New England women who ran the machines at Waltham and Lowell and Manchester and elsewhere, being away from the family was new and exciting and provided them with a sense of value and of solidarity between themselves. Though most of these mill girls sent the biggest part of their wages home, having even a small amount of money of their own was a liberating experience. And many women used their earnings to buy themselves clothes or other consumer goods. The long hours, the strict discipline, and the low wages, however, soon led even these workers to organize, to protest their working conditions and their pay. In 1821, the young women employed by the BMC in Waltham went on strike for 2 days when their wages were cut. In 1824, workers in Pawtucket struck to oppose reduced pay rates and longer hours and reduced time for meals. Similar strikes happened at Lowell and in other mill towns like Dover, New Hampshire, where the women struck in 1828 after their wages were reduced. In the 1830s, mill workers in Lowell formed the Lowell Factory Girls Association to organize strike activities in the face of wage cuts, and later established the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association to protest the 12-hour workday. Even though these strikes were rarely successful, and workers usually were forced to accept reduced wages and increased hours, these work stoppages and labor protests formed the beginnings of a new labor movement in the United States, which we'll see developing as we go forward. But that's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.